8 years were erased from your life, but you don't remember a single second of that time. You don't know where you were, what happened to you, or why you're still alive. This is not just a story about a strange disappearance. This is a story about a return that raises far more questions than the vanishing itself. 3 people entered Mount Shasta. 8 years later, one of them was found curled up in a snow measurement station deep in the forest, a hollow human being, a man with no name, no memories. What happened to him, and the fate of the other 2, remains a mystery that chills the blood. The most terrifying thing about this story is the silence. The silence of the mountain and the silence of the sole survivor. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On October 13, 2012, the early autumn sunlight stretched across the ice-covered slopes of Mount Shasta, one of the most massive and dangerous volcanic peaks in Northern California, where mixed rock snow ice inclines combined with crevasses left by lava flows create terrain that can easily disorient even experienced climbers. The Bunny Flat Trailhead area, a familiar starting point for amateur climbing groups, was fairly quiet that morning. Light winds but low temperatures signaled weather conditions that could change unexpectedly. Something familiar to anyone who has ever set foot in the Cascades. 3 young men appeared at the registration point: Evan Lake, a 28-year-old software engineer, Joel Carter, a 29-year-old logistics worker, and Daniel Rios, a 27-year-old mechanical technician. In the Avalanche Gulch route registration record, Evan was listed as the group representative. He had studied the elevation maps in advance and planned for them to camp for 2 nights and return on October 15th. Although none of the 3 were seasoned mountaineers, they viewed this trip as a planned challenge, a short, manageable journey suited to early winter conditions. At 7:42 a.m., the trailhead camera captured the last image of the group, all 3 moving briskly, carrying moderate backpacks, with steady steps and no signs of anything unusual. That same afternoon, at 5:12, Evan sent a final text to his sister, saying the ascent was harder than expected and they would stop early to set up camp. After that point, all communication ceased. No further calls, texts or data pings appeared in carrier logs. By noon on October 14th, when the group failed to return on schedule, family members began calling non-stop, but all 3 phones went unanswered. The prolonged loss of contact, combined with the hazardous nature of the climbing area during the seasonal transition, prompted the ranger station to initiate mandatory verification, checking lodging information, contacting the registered numbers, and sending personnel to the parking area to confirm the group's SUV was still there. When all signs indicated the group had not left the mountain, the official search operation was activated. That very afternoon of October 14th, Siskiyou County Search and Rescue Forces, in coordination with the Mount Shasta Ranger Team, launched an urgent setter campaign, beginning by dividing the area into a grid pattern to systematically cover each search cell. Foot teams were directed along 3 main routes based on the registered itinerary, with Avalanche Gulch and Horse Camp prioritized for initial sweeps as the most common stopping points for amateur climbers. Sheriff's helicopters flew circular patterns at 8,000 to 10,000 feet to look for tent sightings, metallic reflections, or unusual terrain changes. In parallel, 2 2012 model drones, lacking infrared cameras and equipped only with basic HD cameras, were deployed to scan slopes that were difficult for helicopters to access. K-9 teams were brought into the lower forested areas where wind and dense vegetation could retain the scent of missing persons. While teams fanned out, the analysis group at the ranger station reviewed all weather data for October 13th and 14. Reports showed a significant increase in wind speed above 9,000 feet, from 12 miles per hour in the morning to over 28 miles per hour at night, strong enough to challenge inexperienced climbers, but not reaching blizzard thresholds that could bury major traces. Temperatures dropped below 30 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn, forming thin ice on rocks, but no reports indicated new snow accumulation within the prior 24 hours. These facts did not entirely rule out severe natural accidents, such as falls into crevasses or burial under snow, but they did not align with the complete clean disappearance suggested by the scene. The group's planned route was cross-checked against high-resolution topographic maps. The Avalanche Gulch route has several blind spots, especially near the stairs and old ski bowl, where fog often settles and fractured rock terrain can easily lead inexperienced hikers off the main trail. Yet when SAR teams reached these areas, no evidence whatsoever indicated they had pitched a tent, rested, or left footprints. No backpacks, sleeping bags, or scattered food items, things that typically appear in scenarios where a group encounters trouble and must lighten loads or seek escape routes. The icy slopes also showed no long slide marks or fresh grooves usually associated with high-elevation falls. The area around Helen Lake, a common rest stop before climbing higher, likewise showed no signs of recent movement in the past 48 hours. The first consolidated SR report noted 3 high-risk zones: the rock-stacked area of Casaval Ridge, the inclined ice near Misery Hill, and the lower southern forested slope where thick vegetation could conceal many traces. However, in all 3 zones, assigned teams found nothing matching the description of the missing group, or any signs of survival. Even more noteworthy was the emergence of a data void, areas where wind was not strong enough to erase tracks, but which showed absolutely no signs of passage whatsoever. Teams were forced to conclude preliminarily that either the group had deviated from the clear route very early, or an unusual event had caused them to leave no footprints or items as seen in other typical mountain accidents. On the second day of the search, as the scope expanded south of the Avalanche Gulch route, a K9 team reported picking up a human scent in an area about 300 meters off the main trail. The scent led them to a patch of dirt mixed with scree between 2 basalt boulders, where they discovered an 18 centimeters length of paracord snagged under an exposed tree root. The fiber material and color did not match any rope or accessory the families confirmed the 3 men had carried. The equipment list registered with the ranger station before the trip also did not include this type of cord. While the temporary forensics team documented and collected the sample, the search continued to widen the sweep around the area, and just minutes later, another find emerged. A footprint pressed into soil still damp from overnight dew, significantly larger than the shoe sizes of all 3 victims. Records showed Evan wore size 10, Joel size 9.5, and Daniel size 9. But the recovered print was estimated at size 12, 13. From rigid-soled boots suited to rocky scree terrain. The stride distance between the prints indicated the owner had a long gait and greater body weight than the victims. Notably, this footprint was on the right side of the slope, completely separate from the usual route, and its direction did not align with the missing group's upward path. Within a roughly 5-meter radius around the footprint, the SR team recorded another sign, a faint drag mark about 1.2 meters long, imprinted on the soil mixed with small rocks. The drag mark lacked a distinct shape, as if from pulling a bag or heavy object, but was consistent enough to suggest a horizontal force had created it. The on-site team measured the width and direction of the drag mark, compared it to the slope angle of the rock surface, and marked the position on the map. All 3 elements, the paracord segment, the large footprint, and the drag mark, were immediately entered into the evidence comparison table. In this process, each item was cross-referenced against the list of gear carried by Evan's group, including photos, material descriptions, and weights. The results showed no matches whatsoever. The 3-person group did not own dark synthetic fiber paracord like the sample recovered. None wore similarly large boots, and the drag mark did not fit the type of equipment they might have dragged, such as sleeping bags or backpacks, which would leave rounded grooves or uneven compression marks when pulled. From this, the coordination team issued its first technical assessment that the scene likely contained traces of a fourth person, an individual not part of the registered climbing plan and not among those confirmed to have been in the Mount Shasta area at the time of the disappearance. Although the nature of this person's involvement could not yet be determined, SAR noted that the footprint and drag mark were located in positions illogical for a simple climbing accident, while the paracord indicated the presence of equipment not belonging to the victims. These facts made the initial assumption of a simple straying or natural accident increasingly difficult to sustain, while introducing a new suspicion into the entire search direction. Once the anomalous evidence was confirmed as unrelated to the three missing men, the analysis group at the ranger station began reconstructing the group's entire movement pattern based on passive GPS data still stored in their devices, primarily battery duration logs, signal loss timestamps, and sporadic cell tower pings sent before all devices shut down simultaneously on the evening of the 13th. Based on the average speed of amateur climbers carrying medium backpacks and the elevation profile of the Avalanche Gulch route, specialists reconstructed an estimated track line from trailhead departure until 3 p.m. The group was most likely still within the main route corridor from 3 p.m. until Evans' 5:12 message. Movement speed dropped sharply, consistent with steep terrain and thin snow. But after that point, device data showed an anomaly: battery drain faster than normal, and two pings deviated from the standard climbing path by several hundred meters to the southwest. Although the data was insufficient to conclusively prove they had left the route, these offset pings led the analysis group to suspect the group may have moved in an unplanned direction before signals vanished completely. Meanwhile, forensics compared the recovered footprint with routes off the main path. Based on print depth, heel strike angle, and toe orientation, they determined the person who left the print had traveled along a looping path on a rocky slope that few would choose, especially those unfamiliar with the terrain. This path coincidentally intersected the area where the group's deviated track line was recorded. When the two data sources, the footprint and the offset GPS pings, were overlaid on the topographic map, an intersection zone emerged, forming a small area where the group and the unidentified individual could have come close to each other within the same time frame. To further check for prior presence of a stranger in the area, the ranger station pulled footage from trail cameras in the expanded Bunny Flat vicinity for the week leading up to the disappearance. One camera positioned on a side path about 1.2 kilometers from the trailhead captured footage of a man in dark clothing, carrying a large backpack, walking alone toward lesser-used routes. The recording timestamp was the morning of October 11th, 2 days before Evans' group set out. The image was blurry, insufficient to identify facial features or clear characteristics, but the build and size of the backpack aligned with the hypothesis that this person may have been carrying gear not typical for standard mountaineering. The appearance of a lone individual, unregistered with the ranger station and heading into rugged terrain before the three-person group vanished, made the data even more noteworthy. Based on all these factors, the coordination team developed a potential encounter point model, identifying 3 high-probability locations where the group's route and the stranger's route could have intersected. A narrow ice section near the stairs, a half-concealed wide rock field on the west side of Avalanche Gulch, and a forested scree patch where the footprint and drag mark were found. Using this model, investigators began constructing possible approach scenarios. Scenario 1. Ambush. The stranger observed the group from afar, selecting advantageous terrain to close in as visibility decreased toward day's end. Scenario 2. Path disruption. The stranger may have redirected the group by creating false markers or blocking part of the trail to force them onto harder terrain. Scenario 3. Separation. If one of the 3 was forced off the trail due to an incident being pulled or threatened, the other 2 may have followed, resulting in all 3 leaving the main road. None of these scenarios were confirmed, but the multiple overlapping indicators across GPS data, the stranger's footprint, and camera footage turned the hypothesis of a fourth person's presence from a mere speculation into a substantiated line of inquiry, forcing SAR forces to broaden their approach rather than focus solely on natural accident possibilities. When abnormal traces from the scene began to reinforce the hypothesis of intervention by a fourth party, the analysis team shifted focus to recovering phone data in order to reconstruct the final moments when the group of three was still active. With no active GPS signals after 5:12 p.m. on October 13th, the technical team had to rely entirely on cell tower pings, the very brief signals phones emit in the background while attempting to connect to the nearest tower. The carrier provided log tables for all three phone numbers, and when laid side by side, one striking phenomenon immediately emerged. From approximately 5:12 p.m. to 7:08 p.m., all three devices continued sending irregular pings, indicating they were still powered on and attempting to connect, albeit with weak signal strength. However, after 7:08 p.m., all three signals vanished simultaneously without the prolonged degradation phase typically seen when a device naturally runs out of battery. All three phones had been fully charged before the trip, and no data suggested heavy usage during that period. This near-simultaneous shutdown led the analysis group to a preliminary conclusion that the three devices did not turn off due to battery depletion or impact from an accident, but were likely forcibly powered off within a very short time window of each other, a rare factor in mountaineering-related disappearances. Meanwhile, the SAR team continued reviewing footage from the drone flyover conducted between 8:10 p.m. that same day. Although the 2012 model drone camera had limited nighttime resolution, specialists noticed an anomaly, a patch of disturbed snow forming a wide arc, roughly 3-4 meters across, located on the eastern side of a secondary slope, about half a kilometer from the main route. The patch was not large enough to indicate an avalanche or long slide, but its shape resembled a surface impacted by lateral pulling force or short-duration chaotic movement. When this location was overlaid with the deviated GPS track line from prior analysis, the two data paths nearly coincided. This suggested the group may have veered toward that area before the phone signals ceased completely. Based on the collected data, the coordination team began constructing a detailed timeline from 5 p.m. on October 13th to 3 a.m. on October 14th. The period considered critical. At 5:12 p.m., Evans sent the final text message from an elevation of 7,500 feet. Between 5:12-6 p.m., all three devices continued pinging with unstable intervals due to movement through signal-shadowed terrain. Around 6:15 p.m., a deviated ping indicated at least one of the three had left the main route by approximately 200 meters to the southwest, aligning with the shoe prints and drag marks later discovered. From 6:37 p.m., ping frequency dropped sharply, suggesting the devices were moving slowly or entering a shielded area. By 7:08 p.m., all three devices halted activity simultaneously. Given the temperature and wind conditions during this window, if the group had suffered an accident, ping signals might have degraded unevenly. But the odds of all three stopping at the exact same moment were extremely low. This made the hypothesis of external interference far more compelling. Between 8-9 p.m., the drone flyover recorded the disturbed snow patch, coinciding with the time SAR believed the group should have been setting up camp per plan. There were no signs of tent pitching or fire starting, an anomaly given that the group had full camping gear prepared. Expanding the time frame to 3 a.m., the analysis team noted two key factors. First, temperatures dropped to freezing levels, yet no attempts were made to use emergency communication devices. Second, no pings reappeared throughout the night. This ruled out temporary signal loss due to weather, as the cell towers on the eastern flank of Shasta remained stable for the following 12 hours. After integrating all data, the deviated GPS track, simultaneous ping shutdown, disturbed snow location, and lack of resumed activity, the investigation team identified 3 choke points, locations with high probability of the group being blocked or suddenly impacted, the first along the deviated track line around 6 p.m. The second near the disturbed snow area captured by drone, and the third where strange shoe prints and drag marks were recorded. When plotted on the composite map, these 3 points formed an S-shaped movement corridor, revealing an abnormal route the group may have taken before completely vanishing from all signal sources. This corridor did not match any logical mountaineering path, but aligned with a scenario in which the group was redirected or led off the main trail for a very brief period before losing communication capability. With the abnormal movement corridor mapped but no endpoint identifiable, investigators were forced to expand the scope to the entire foothill area and Mount Shasta access system, starting with a review of all vehicles recorded at the trailhead from October 12 to 15. A list of 27 vehicles was compiled, but only 19 owners responded immediately. The rest required DMV plate tracing, leading to interviews with solo hikers, trail running groups, a long-distance traveling couple, and 2 short-term camping parties. None reported encountering the missing trio or observing signs of conflict or unusual movement on October 13th. A silver pickup not logged in the trailhead record drew the most attention, but its owner was later located, a dead pine collector from the Weed area, with solid alibis and consistent statements. After clearing vehicle traces, investigators began checking unauthorized cabins and camps scattered along eastern and southeastern forest routes of Shasta. Since summer 2011-2012, the Forest Service had documented numerous illegal squatter setups by seasonal nomads, small-scale prospectors, and unregistered off-grid individuals. Task forces accessed over 14 informal residences, many abandoned well before the disappearance. At the 3 still occupied cabins, occupants underwent ID verification, violence-related criminal history checks, and movement timeline corroboration via neighbor statements or nearby trail cameras. None matched the shoe prints, size, movement patterns, or time frame near the suspected corridor. One reclusive man named Jake M., with a 1998 assault history, was detained for deeper questioning due to frequent eastern forest travel near the GPS deviation. However, he proved presence in Redding on October 13th via transaction receipts and auto shop witness statements. All high-risk subjects were eventually cleared, causing the initially strong fourth-party hypothesis to become tenuous in the absence of any matching identity, vehicle, or residence evidence. Next, police systematically reviewed records of local individuals with histories of assault, abduction, opportunistic crime, or vagrancy around Shasta. The list exceeded 60, categorized by risk level and behavioral patterns. Though some had forest travel habits, none placed them within 10 miles of the disappearance area at the time. No gas stations recorded unusual transactions, no traffic cameras captured suspicious vehicles, and rangers reported no abnormal stranger activity. Legally, the case still lacked a crucial element: no bodies, no witnesses, no communications, no DNA definitive physical evidence, and no sufficiently solid behavioral pattern to justify broader search warrants. Items like paracord segments and drag marks were insufficient to establish criminal conduct, especially in a mountain area rife with similar rope and climbing gear. After 3 months of continuous scene reanalysis, searches coordinated with specialized teams from Oregon and Washington, no new leads emerged. The file was placed in limbo, showing anomalies yet lacking any identifying proof. By late 2012, after the compiled report to the FBI yielded no further conclusions, the case was officially classified as a cold case per Siskiyou County Protocol. Raw data, scene maps, seized evidence, and interview records were sealed and archived to be reopened only with new evidence or an unexpected breakthrough from behavioral analysis systems. Mount Shasta, once merely a geographic backdrop, had become a vast information void enveloping the entire case, and the 3 vanished as though they had never existed on that trail. 8 years after the file was frozen, on a foggy winter morning, Forest Service maintenance crews received an error alert from an automated snow measurement station deep in the eastern forest of Mount Shasta, a location rarely visited. Upon arrival, they found the metal equipment enclosure pried open from the inside and near impossible feat since the mechanical lock could only be opened from outside. Inside the chamber, they discovered a man curled up next to the solar battery array, wrapped in tattered rags, shivering violently from cold, barefoot, and so emaciated he could not stand unaided. His eyes were glazed, responding poorly to light, and every time he heard the maintenance helicopter's engine overhead, he instinctively covered his ears as if in severe pain. The man repeated only a few disjointed phrases, "Please don't take me back down, and don't let them hear." He carried no identification or personal items, only narrow, banded scars encircling his wrists and ankles, suggestive of prolonged restraint. As rescuers extracted him from the forest and airlifted him directly to the Weed Medical Station, paramedics quickly noted severe dehydration, long-term malnutrition, hypothermia, and especially thick calluses around the ankles, clear friction injuries from extended contact with hard surfaces. During initial treatment, a nurse observed him repeatedly muttering the name Evan, though unable to articulate anything further coherent. Recognizing possible ties to long-ago missing persons cases, police immediately ran fingerprints through the Cal ID system. On the second scan, it returned a 98% match to the record of Evan Lake, one of the 3 climbers who vanished on Mount Shasta in 2012. The result left the entire duty room silent for several seconds. Evan's name had been absent from all reports for 8 years, his file once marked "no recovery probability." In a brief moment of lucidity, the first words Evan spoke upon waking were, "What year is it now?" And immediately after, as though still fleeing something unseen, he trembled and asked, "Are they here?" The 8-year blank period was starkly evident in the bewilderment and profound fear in his eyes, leading the duty team to sense this was no ordinary drifter case. Identity verification was strengthened through dental record comparison, surgical scars and morphological features, all matching Evan's 2012 file information. Upon final confirmation, Siskiyou County was immediately notified, and the case status shifted from cold case to active investigation under emergency protocol. The original case officer was recalled, stored evidence and scene maps were unsealed, all 2012 reports were ordered re-reviewed within 48 hours. Evan was isolated from general population and transferred to a protected medical facility to prevent disruptive contact or information leaks. Physicians promptly ordered comprehensive analysis of old and new injuries, scar tissue, metabolic condition, and signs of prolonged captivity. Federal special agents were also notified to assess whether Evan's reappearance involved interstate criminal conduct. Within 24 hours, the full federal system from FBI USFS law enforcement to behavioral analysis unit was mobilized. The discovery of a victim from an 8-year-old disappearance found in a state of utter exhaustion inside a pried-open snowtel station deep in Mount Shasta forest, bearing clear marks of years of control, was unprecedented in any case file of comparable ambiguity to the 2012 Shasta incident. Evan's discovery at the snowtel site completely shattered the accident-death hypothesis long regarded as the most plausible scenario for nearly a decade, forcing the entire investigative process to restart from scratch. But this time, with an inexplicable variable, during 8 years off every tracking system, where was Evan held, by whom, and how did he manage to escape and reach an equipment station in the middle of a freezing forest night? When Evan was just stable enough to be transferred to the in-depth examination area, the forensic medical team immediately began a comprehensive evaluation. From just the initial observation, the doctors recognized that the pattern of injuries on his body did not match any known cases of long-term survival in a natural environment, but instead bore characteristic signs of prolonged confinement under controlled conditions of light, movement, and nutrition, spanning many years. Evan's blood vitamin D level was dangerously low, low enough that the doctors stated he had had no exposure to sunlight for an extended period, at least several years or more. Because such a severe deficiency could not develop in just a few months. It typically only appears in individuals locked in closed rooms or underground bunkers. Bone density was severely reduced. DEXA scan results showed 18–22% loss of mineral density in the forearm and femur bones, equivalent to an elderly person bedridden for many years. This was also a sign reflecting movement, restricted to a bare minimum, perhaps allowing only a few steps within a very narrow range. On Evan's wrists and ankles, the forensic team noted thick calluses distributed in rings around the limbs, unlike friction marks from climbing ropes or sports equipment. The callus structure repeated in cycles, building up in successive layers, suggesting Evan may have been tied or secured to a fixed point for a prolonged period. With repeated rubbing creating ring scars, a type of injury that only occurs when wrist movement is restricted for months or years. Beneath those callus layers were old scars, difficult to see with the naked eye, but clearly visible under infrared imaging, small stress fractures in the radius and ulna bones of both arms, dating back at least 6–7 years, suggesting Evan had endured prolonged pressure forcing him to lie in one position or been tied with strong pulling force. On the right eighth rib was an old healed fracture that was not perfectly aligned, indicating he had once suffered a hard impact against a rigid object, untreated and left to recover on its own, in conditions lacking medical care. Chemical analysis of the skin surface and hair samples yielded a particularly striking finding: ethylene oxide, a compound commonly used for sterilizing sealed equipment, chambers, or low ventilation environments, was present at trace but consistent levels across hair layers. This proved Evan had lived in an environment with continuous presence of this chemical for a duration matching the hair length, approximately 8 years. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence indicating the place of confinement was a closed, poorly ventilated space, routinely sterilized or treated with chemicals. Hair structure also revealed distinct nutritional layers. Segments from the first year after his disappearance showed a sharp drop in protein and essential fatty acids. The middle period showed very low stability, with no sign of improvement. The final period had a slight increase in micronutrients, but still at minimal levels. This suggests the diet provided to Evan was only sufficient to sustain life. A restricted, repetitive ration consisting mainly of simple starches, very little protein, and almost no fresh vegetables or fruits. Fingernail analysis reinforced this pattern. Bose lines, horizontal grooves on the nails, caused by periods of malnutrition or prolonged stress, appeared in clusters at regular intervals, indicating recurring cycles of nutritional deficit on a monthly or quarterly basis. Consistent with confinement, in a location with limited and fully controlled food supply, Evan's body also showed extremely elevated baseline cortisol levels, proving he had lived in a state of chronic stress for many years. Signs in the peripheral nervous system, particularly finger tremor and slowed muscle reflexes, indicated he had been forced to maintain sitting or kneeling postures for longer than physiologically sustainable, possibly due to confinement in a tight space. His ankles displayed mild drop foot, a sign of weakened extensor muscles from lack of activity, commonly seen in individuals shackled in positions preventing full leg extension. Based on all the data, the forensic team constructed a timeline comparison of injuries from estimated 2013 to 2020. Phase 1, bone density began declining. First calluses appeared, endocrine stress signs. Phase 2, microfractures formed, clear binding scars, acute malnutrition. Phase 3, hair accumulated stable ethylene oxide levels, mild muscle atrophy, calcium metabolism disorder. Phase 4, slight nutritional improvement but still low, signs of controlled environment confinement. Phase 5, injuries maintained with no fresh damage near the time Evan was found, suggesting he may have escaped or been removed shortly before discovery. When the full injury pattern was laid out together, there was no longer any doubt. Evan had not survived in the wilderness for 8 years. He had been held in a confined, light-deprived environment that was difficult to escape from and under complete control of both movement and nutrition. More importantly, the injury pattern was too consistent to be random. It could only have formed under the prolonged, deliberate influence of humans. When Evan's body showed clear signs of prolonged confinement, the forensic psychology team began interviews using protocols for victims isolated from the environment for many years. But from the very first session, they realized his cognitive pattern did not resemble linear memory, but rather a series of fragmented, disjointed pieces. Evan often described events in terms of sensations rather than images. He could not pinpoint dates or sequence, but remembered very clearly solitary sounds, cyclical repeating rhythms, background vibrations, and odors consistently present over long periods. The team recorded 3 prominent groups of sensory signals. The first group was sounds. Evan repeatedly mentioned a steady growling, like an old engine, the light metallic ringing of a fan, and especially a 2-second interval slackening sound he described as similar to a worn fan belt or a generator under no load. Accompanying this was dripping water, not a flowing stream, but discrete drops falling, echoing slightly, as if in a low-ceilinged space or stone-walled area. The second group was odors. Evan described a sharp, dry chemical smell like industrial disinfectant mixed with hot dust. This detail matched the ethylene oxide test results, a chemical rarely present in natural environments but common in sterilization rooms, equipment storage, or sealed spaces maintained with basic hygiene measures. He also mentioned a faint damp earth smell mixed with rusting metal, suggesting an environment not entirely artificial but possibly combining natural materials with human-assembled structures. The third group was background vibration. Evan described the ground vibrating lightly in rhythm at certain regular times, possibly hourly, or tied to equipment operation cycles. Based on his description, mechanical experts inferred very low but stable amplitude vibrations, consistent with an old generator mounted on uneven concrete or stone foundations. Another crucial detail was that Evan heard no wind, rain, or animal sounds, indicating he was in a space almost completely soundproofed from the natural environment. From those sensory signals, the team constructed 3 plausible confinement environment models. The first possibility was a man-made sealed bunker, low-ceilinged, small area, hand-built or modified, poor ventilation, using a generator for minimal power. This fit the chemical odor, ground vibration, and complete absence of natural sounds. The second possibility was a modified natural lava tube or rock cavity. Many areas around Mount Shasta have old lava tube systems, some with narrow but thermally stable spaces. If the captor utilized one of these cavities and added equipment and power, the sound-odor pattern Evan described could fully emerge. The third possibility was a lava tube cave, a common structure in ancient volcanic regions. They have low ceilings, characteristic echo, and can sustain light vibration when heavy objects are placed inside. However, lava tubes typically have high humidity and strong mineral odors. Evan described only very faint damp earth smell, making this possibility rated lower than the other 2. The psychologists also noted that Evan's fragmented memory exhibited classic symptoms of long-term environmental isolation, loss of time orientation, inability to gauge day, night length, and retention only of the strongest repeating environmental signals. When asked to describe the space, Evan only recalled cold walls, low ceiling, and having to duck his head every time he stood up, reinforcing the hypothesis of severely limited headroom. When asked about windows, vents, or airflow, he stated nothing moved, indicating an almost completely sealed environment with no natural convection. Another key detail was in his description of blocked sound. Evan recalled that when there was a loud noise, possibly from outside, the sound did not transmit normally, but was compressed, as if heard through multiple layers of earth and rock. This matched semi-subterranean or fully underground structures. Finally, when combining all sensory data with physical injuries, the investigative team concluded that Evan was not moved much across phases. The confinement environment appeared fixed and small-scale, equipped with basic mechanical devices, periodic food delivery, and maintained in a prolonged sealed state. In other words, the captor did not merely abduct him, they had prepared a secret holding facility in a very inaccessible location, possibly deep within the natural terrain around Mount Shasta, or illegally built and carefully camouflaged to avoid detection for 8 years. When new leads from the sensory testimony and forensic conclusions indicated Evan had been held in a fixed-structure confined environment, the investigative team decided to reactivate the entire 2012 case file with technologies unavailable 8 years earlier, starting with recovery of the SAR drone flyover images recorded on the night of October 13 and early morning of October 14, 2012. The raw data had been very noisy, low resolution, and lacking detail in low-light conditions, but the new AI-enhanced reconstruction system could denoise, analyze motion, and rebuild terrain shapes using deep learning algorithms. After 36 hours of processing, one frame from the 20:47 p.m. flight clearly showed a faint 3-meter-long drag mark previously overlooked due to image noise. AI determined the snow surface was disturbed horizontally, consistent with the dragging a heavy object pattern the analysis team had suspected after reviewing reports of drag marks on rocky soil. In another frame, the 3D elevation model reconstructed from oblique shots revealed a small depression beneath the snow, possibly a footprint or temporary heavy object placement. These details, when overlaid onto the 2012 search map, showed an anomalous movement path not only aligning with the previously constructed SEDS corridor, but potentially caused by a fourth individual dragging or manipulating an object that night. In parallel with reanalyzing the photos, the technical team conducted 3D LiDAR scanning of the shoe prints collected in 2012. Current lab LiDAR technology allowed reconstruction of sole pressure patterns, wear and snow compression ratios, details that in 2012 were only manually noted. Results showed the prints did not match any common trekking boot models of that time, but belonged to high-ankle tactical boots with custom Vibram soles, typically found only in lines for paramilitary, professional bushcraft, or custom handmade footwear. The shoe sole manufacturer database identified this pattern as compatible with 3 niche brands with very low sales volume in Northern California, one of which had a custom order placed in Redding in 2011-2012. This opened a lead for tracing purchaser lists. Meanwhile, the most critical piece of evidence, the section of paracord found by K9 in 2012, was re-examined using next-generation synthetic fiber analysis. In 2012, the report only identified it as common nylon cord, but 2020 analysis determined the fiber structure as nylon 6, with an 8-braid weave and polyester core for abrasion resistance. This type of cord was not available in ordinary mountaineering shops, but typically purchased through industrial suppliers or forestry technical groups. Moreover, the cord showed uneven cuts from a small serrated knife, along with tiny burn marks on the fiber ends, indicating the user had heat-sealed the ends, a habit common among loggers, shelter builders, or anyone using cord to secure gear in damp environments. The team traced 5 stores that sold this type of cord within a 200-mile radius of Shasta during 2011-2013. Some stores retained credit card transaction records and internal invoices, allowing filtering to a list of roughly over 40 buyers in the Redding, Rika, Dunsmuir areas and parts of southern border Oregon. When synthesizing all data, the rare boot model, uncommon cord type, anomalous movement path in AI-enhanced images, drag marks, and SEDS corridor location, the investigative team built a potential suspect list based on 3 criteria: 1 individuals with access to Mount Shasta in 2012, 2 individuals with residence or activity history in the southeastern forest area, and 3 individuals whose equipment purchase behavior matched the evidence. The filtering process eliminated buyers using the cord for industrial or agricultural work, focusing on solitary living individuals or those frequently spending extended time in the woods. Approximately 12 people matched both shoe and cord indicators. Among them, 4 had documented travel near the suspected corridor area per ranger reports from 2010-2013. The final list, for the first time in 8 years of investigation, produced a set of suspects that could be realistically queried instead of relying on broad, unsubstantiated assumptions, marking a major shift from passive analysis to proactive pursuit based on modern forensic technology and evidence previously deemed insufficient in the early phase. Merely by reconstructing small details of the 2012 scene, the investigative team now had sufficient grounds to conclude that the fourth person was not a casual passerby, but very likely an individual who prepared meticulously, brought specialized equipment, and possessed material handling habits consistent with the confinement environment Evan described. A breakthrough far beyond the complete deadlock of 2012. This very assessment led the technical team to decide to expand from evidence analysis to environmental analysis, deploying a method never before used in the Shasta case, sensory mapping. This technique is based on reconstructing all the sensory signals Evan provided, sounds, background vibrations, odors, and correlating them with geological, geothermal, and microseismic data from Mount Shasta. Starting from the detail Evan described of a generator running steadily but sagging in rhythm every 2 seconds, the technical team proceeded to match the sound pattern against 4 common older model generator lines used in the Northern California forest area during the period 1990-2010. Honda EX series, Generac 4000, Coleman PowerMate, and Yamaha EF 2400i. Simulations of frequency vibrations, rhythm sagging, and cyclic variations were run through the audio spectrum analysis system. The results showed that 2 models, Honda EX 350 and Generac 4000, produced the closest cyclic RPM drop rhythm, especially when operating in poorly ventilated environments. This data was input into sensory layer 01, marking areas where generator sound could propagate according to the resonance pattern Evan described, within a maximum radius of 150 meters from the assumed source. The second data layer was micro-tremor, natural and anthropogenic micro-vibrations around Shasta. Evan described the ground vibrating lightly in a steady rhythm. Unlike an earthquake or rock slide, it resembled background vibration from mechanical equipment placed on uneven surfaces. USGS provided a high-resolution micro-tremor map of the area, and when experts overlaid Evan's described vibration pattern onto the map, they found this vibration type only matched areas with upper-layer hollow basalt, but a denser lower layer, a foundation that caused generator vibrations to spread weakly and evenly, rather than reflecting in multiple layers. When overlaying the micro-tremor layer onto the Shasta area, only 27 geological zones remained with matching structure. The third data layer came from the odor description. Evan clearly recalled a sharp chemical smell mixed with mineral odor and a faint damp sulfur scent like hot earth vapor. USGS geothermal mapping confirmed 14 weak geothermal gas leak points along the eastern and southeastern slopes of Shasta, where sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide occasionally vent through rock fissures. In enclosed conditions, even a very small amount of this gas is sufficient to create the metallic sulfur smell Evan described. When analysts overlaid the geothermal layer onto the microtremor map, the number of matching zones dropped from 27 to 9. The final layer in sensory mapping concerned possible unauthorized built structures, based on the characteristics Evan described: low ceiling, no airflow, cold walls, minimal echo. The technical team eliminated locations near streams, near open cave mouths, or with strong air currents. They retained only sites with thick basalt, few fractures, and located far from main trails to avoid detection. The final filtering system then eliminated another 6 of the 9 points. Ultimately, from an initial total of 217 potential points within a 20-mile radius, the sensory mapping map narrowed it down to just 3 high-suspicion locations. Point A, located within a partially collapsed lava tube basalt cluster. Point B, a deep natural rock alcove previously recorded as having signs of human modification, and Point C, a semi-subterranean structure, once flagged in Forest Service records in 2009 as an unauthorized shelter, owner not located. All three locations are in extremely difficult to access areas, do not appear on tourist maps, and do not overlap with any routes the three-person group had registered. This was the first time in 8 years that, based on the combination of sensory forensic evidence and modern mapping technology, the investigation was able to narrow suspect locations from hundreds down to just 3 possible sites containing the secret confinement structure. 3 structures that matched almost perfectly with what Evan had perceived throughout his 8 years missing from the world. When sensory mapping narrowed the scope to 3 suspect points, the field team deployed ultra-small drones equipped with infrared cameras and CO2 sensors to survey without creating noise or leaving traces. Points A and B only showed shallow rock alcoves, not deep enough to contain a confinement chamber as Evan described, but at Point C, the semi-subterranean structure vaguely noted in 2009 records, the drone detected an anomalous thermal area around a large moss-covered boulder. When the drone descended, the camera captured a square shape hidden in the shadows. A rotted wooden panel shifted to one side as if used to cover an entrance downward. The wood surface showed saw and nail marks from multiple different tools, indicating it had been repeatedly removed and reinstalled. When the field team approached directly, they found the panel secured by 2 rusted metal pins, beneath which was a shaft about 2.5 meters deep. No staircase, only rough wooden steps attached to the earthen wall for limited climbing up and down. Inside, the space was only about 2.2 meters wide and less than 1.7 meters high, exactly as Evan described when he said that, "Every time I stood up I had to bow my head." The damp smell, faint sharp chemical odor, and trace damp sulfur immediately recalled the geothermal data layer from sensory mapping, making the examination team nearly certain this was the confinement structure. On the left side of the chamber, attached to the earthen wall, was a homemade handcuff set made of soft steel and decayed nylon rope, clearly showing an 8-braid pattern matching the parachute cord sample recovered in 2012. On the ground, less than half a meter from the corner wall, was another shorter piece of the same rope, partially cut with tiny burn marks at the end, as if singed to seal it, reinforcing conclusions about the captor's handmade techniques. Near the east wall, the team found a small wooden board leaning against the wall, its surface covered with consecutive carved marks in rows. When counted and cross-referenced, the number of marks matched over 2,000 days, a form of day-counting notation the victim may have used to retain a sense of time. On the chamber ceiling, a rusted metal hook protruded, showing wear consistent with hanging a lamp or small mechanical device, most likely the source of light or a rudimentary ventilation system. In the corner of the chamber, the team collected samples of fine ash, apparently remnants of paper or organic material burned multiple times, suggesting destruction of notes or food packaging. Experts collected this ash for cellulose and residual chemical analysis. On the ground, when illuminated at an angle, very fine hair strands appeared, possibly Evan's or someone else's who had been present in this space. Each strand was collected with specialized adhesive tape to prevent cross-contamination. The west wall surface still retained faint handprints, not visible to the naked eye, but revealed under forensic orange light. The examination team lifted these prints, using gelatin lifters for later database comparison. Additionally, there were numerous faint scratch marks on the walls at heights consistent with a person's reach, while hand movement was restricted by binding, indicating prolonged attempts at resistance or efforts to stand. Particularly, at the corner matching Evan's dripping water description, investigators found a thin rubber tube leading from the ceiling, its end crudely sealed with a rotted cloth piece. Water dripped from the tube, slow and irregular, identical to the sound memory Evan described throughout the interviews. The final part of the examination involved collecting 3-layer soil samples, surface layer in contact with the wall, and layer mixed with ash for comparison with samples adhering to Evan's skin and hair. Once all samples, traces, and evidence were fully collected, there was no longer any doubt about the nature of the chamber. This was not a temporary shelter, not a natural cave casually used. It was a deliberately prepared and modified space designed to hold a human being for an extended period. And now, with the confinement chamber right before their eyes, the investigation was no longer about hypotheses. It was entering the phase of tracking down the individual who had operated this underground cell for many years. From the underground chamber, a narrow path leading southeast drew attention because the ground surface was more compacted than the surrounding area, resembling the trace of repeated travel. The field team followed this path for over 300 meters, where the terrain shifted to broken rock mixed with dry clay. At a small slope, the scout drone detected an anomaly in the vegetation, a sunken area about 1 meter in diameter, covered with fresher pine needles than the surrounding layer. When the examination team approached, merely brushing aside the thin layer of needles revealed a human leg bone structure. The area was immediately cordoned off, and a careful forensic excavation was initiated. Beneath the shallow soil, nearly intact skeletal remains of an adult male were found in a side-lying position, head turned toward the rock alcove, both hands pulled behind and secured with decayed nylon rope. Although the rope remained only in fragments, the braid style and fiber structure were sufficient for the forensic team to recognize it matched the rope found in the chamber and the type seized in 2012. Even the ligature position on the wrist bones showed similar width and angulation to the scar impressions on Evan, indicating the same binding method had been used. The forensic team identified these remains as those of Joel Carter after cross-referencing dental records and morphological features. Identification was rapid because Joel had an upper molar filled with amalgam containing a characteristic silver ratio, matching his pre-disappearance dental records. The degree of decomposition allowed experts to estimate time of death around late 2013, only 1 year after the group's disappearance and many years before Evan was found. There were no signs of blunt or sharp force trauma to bones, no skull injury, but rib bone analysis showed Joel had suffered prolonged hypoxia prior to death, evidenced by repeated thin bone banding, a sign of restricted breathing due to binding posture. Soil analysis around the remains indicated this burial site had not been disturbed for many years, meaning the perpetrator likely buried Joel shortly after death and never returned to check or move the body. A key detail emerged when investigators found a drag mark of nylon rope pulled from the direction of the chamber to the burial pit, perfectly matching the faint drag trace detected in the 2012 drone photo after AI enhancement. This created a direct link between the old chain of evidence and the newly discovered structure, allowing reconstruction of the event timeline. Joel was held in the underground chamber for a period before dying years earlier than Evan. The scratch marks on Joel's wrist and ankle bones were identical in pattern to the injuries on Evan's body, differing only in severity, reinforcing the model that both had been bound under the same conditions, with the same equipment, and under the control of the same captor. The presence of Joel's remains not only confirmed that this location had once held multiple victims, but also showed a clear starting point for the crime cycle, 2013, marked by Joel's death, opening a chain of prolonged confinement, lasting many years until Evan escaped and reappeared near Weed after 8 years missing. Finding Joel's remains not only resolved part of the 2012 disappearance mystery, but also demonstrated the extremely serious and systematic nature of the criminal behavior. Not an accident, not impulsive action, but a deliberate chain of confinement leading to at least one death. This event immediately elevated the case priority to a major felony involving homicide, unlawful imprisonment, and the possibility of additional undiscovered victims. From the location where Joel Carter's remains were found, the investigation team expanded the survey radius based on the perpetrator's body disposal behavior pattern, especially focusing on areas with light geothermal gas leaks, because the sensory mapping had previously indicated that the sulfur smell Evan smelled could come from this zone. As they moved deeper into the southeastern slope, where basalt fractured into large slabs interspersed with hot gas pockets, the drone detected an anomalous discolored soil area, yellow-brown staining from sulfur impact, and a lightly disturbed surface inconsistent with the natural geological distribution of the area. When the field team checked directly, they noticed this area was covered by deliberately placed boulders in an arc shape to camouflage a patch of ground just large enough to bury a body. When the stones were cleared, they found the skull and shoulder bones exposed under thin soil, accompanied by a stronger sulfur smell than surrounding areas. Emergency forensic excavation was conducted, and as soon as the second set of remains was brought to the surface, experts noted this was not a contemporaneous death with Joel. The skeleton still had significant dried fibrous tissue adhering to joints, indicating a much later time of death. After cross-referencing dental records and DNA analysis from molars, the victim was identified as Daniel Rios, the third member of the 2012 missing hiking group. Unlike Joel, Daniel was found in a curled position, hands also pulled behind, but with more intact binding rope, showing that preservation conditions under sulfur-rich soil slowed nylon fiber decomposition. Bone analysis revealed multiple stress fractures from prolonged malnutrition, but no direct violent trauma. Time of death was estimated at 2016, 3 years after Joel's death and 3 years before Evan's escape, confirming a prolonged non-simultaneous confinement cycle with clear temporal separation between victims. This revealed a new feature in the perpetrator's behavior. He did not kill victims immediately, but maintained them in a controlled state of debilitation. And when one died, the confinement cycle for the next victim was extended rather than shortened. This is a sign of extreme manipulative behavior and increasing control levels through each phase. However, the most shocking element at Daniel's burial site was not the remains, but an artifact mixed in the soil. A small piece of paper, partially rotted but still legible with a few lines of scrawled handwriting. When processed under infrared light, the text became clear. He didn't listen. I can't let that happen again. This scrap showed no signs of burning and may have been discarded or dropped from the perpetrator's belongings during burial. This was the first time investigators obtained a written indication of the perpetrator's thinking or psychological state, and the wording revealed a distorted logic. The victim didn't listen, possibly meaning failure to comply, failure to respond as desired, or failure to maintain behavior the perpetrator deemed necessary, leading him to view the death as something that can't be allowed to happen again, implying Joel's death may have been seen as a deviation from the behavioral standard the perpetrator wanted to enforce thereafter. This suggests a dangerous escalation from an early phase of confinement leading to early death to a second phase of prolonging survival using more sophisticated control measures, including minimal cyclical feeding, tightly restricted movement conditions, and possibly forms of psychological coercion. The scratch marks on Evan's chamber walls and the day count tally further support the hypothesis that the perpetrator closely monitored victims' deterioration, keeping them alive as long as possible within a set pattern. Forensic results at Daniel's remains site also showed deeper nylon ligature impressions on the wrists compared to Joel, consistent with the model that the perpetrator had tightened physical control over time. From the discovery of Joel's remains near the chamber to finding Daniel in the sulfur gas area, the time gaps in deaths and shared indicators create a clearer picture. The perpetrator held and adjusted treatment of each victim according to an evolving cycle of criminal behavior, increasing control levels, extending victim survival time, and gradually reducing the errors he believed had occurred in the early phase. The discovery of Daniel's remains, along with the highly suggestive note, not only adds further evidence of systematic crime, but also marks a turning point in understanding the perpetrator's motive and crime pattern, a behavior that has far exceeded the original missing persons case, becoming a prolonged chain of confinement and death over many years with increasing sophistication. When the two bodies had been recovered and the underground cell clearly identified, the investigative team shifted to the phase of building the perpetrator profile by compiling all forensic, behavioral, and geographic data collected from 2012 to the present. The first step was to match the rare boot model found from the 2012 shoe prints with the list of individuals who had purchased or ordered custom Vibram-soled tactical boots in the Northern California area. From an initial pool of over 40 buyers, the automated filtering system eliminated those whose travel schedules did not align or who lived too far from the Shasta area, narrowing the list down to 12 individuals. When the paracord sample was analyzed more deeply and cross-referenced with transaction records from industrial supply stores that sold 8-braid polyester core rope, the team further eliminated buyers who purchased large quantities for agricultural or logging work. The remaining list consisted of just 5 individuals who had bought lengths of rope matching the segments found at the scene. Overlaying this data onto the sensory mapping chart and determining who among them had lived or operated near all 3 suspect points left only one person meeting all 3 criteria: presence in the Shasta region during 2011-2016, access to the cell entrance at location C without drawing attention, and movement patterns aligning with the reconstructed corridor as derived from offset GPS data. That person was Leonard Brackett. Brackett, 47 years old, was an isolationist survivalist who had resided in multiple unregistered temporary cabins around southeastern Shasta. He had a history of violence dating back to the late 1990s, including 2 assaults on acquaintances during disputes while living off-grid. Siskiyou County Sheriff's records noted his proficiency in building shelters, digging temporary pits, crafting basic tools, and frequently repairing equipment with scavenged materials, consistent with the crude but structurally deliberate underground cell discovered. In 2012, Brackett was documented by rangers as appearing at least 3 times near the Eastern Auxiliary Trail in Shasta, and once he was warned for erecting an illegal lean-to less than 1.5 miles from Point C. When his behavioral characteristics were compared to the crime pattern derived from the evidence, the matches became evident: one, ability to control a confined environment over extended periods and maintain victims at minimal survival levels. 2, knowledge of lava terrain and geothermal gas pockets, explaining the choice of a sulfur venting site to bury Daniel and mask decomposition odor. 3, capability to build and operate an old generator in a low ventilation setting. 4, escalating control behavior over time, consistent with the unstable psychology of a long-term isolate. When the behavioral analysis team matched information about Brackett with the scrap of paper found near Daniel's body, they observed that the handwriting closely resembled samples from his 2004 detention record. The elongated 2 crossbars, faint right-leaning periods, and the underline beneath the phrase "Kong Geen" all aligned. Additionally, the boot model Brackett had custom ordered in 2011, a tactical Vibram-soled boot for rocky terrain, perfectly matched the 3D scanned shoe print model. When investigators reviewed old receipts from an outlying hardware store in Redding, they located a 2011 cash purchase of high-strength 8-braid paracord under the name Leonard B., with a blank P.O. box address. Overlaying all forensic datasets, rope, boots, geology, cell structure, body locations, with Brackett's presence history and behavior left no other matching suspect in the records. The primary suspect profile was finalized. Leonard Brackett, isolated survivalist, advanced survival skills, manual underground construction capability, violent history, movement routes overlapping detention sites, and physical evidence matching in both behavior and materials. He was not merely the most viable candidate, every layer of data converged on one point: Brackett was the only individual with the capability, opportunity, and behavioral pattern fitting the discovered sequence of captivity and deaths, from Joel in 2013, Daniel in 2016, to Evan, the final surviving victim after 8 years in the underground pit. Once the suspect profile fully converged on Leonard Brackett, law enforcement immediately transitioned to the operational phase to prevent him from fleeing into the complex forested and mountainous terrain around Shasta. Using ranger data and surface thermal satellite imagery, the pursuit team confirmed Brackett was still maintaining a temporary cabin in the southeastern forest belt approximately 3 air miles from the cell location. To avoid alerting him, the SWAT team deployed flare drones at night, using thermal sensors to monitor activity in the area. After just 2 sweeps, flare detected a stable heat signature, most likely a human body, moving slowly around the cabin, along with a smaller heat source emanating from a generator behind it. This matched the constructed behavioral model. Brackett typically serviced the generator at night and moved within a limited radius. At 3:14 a.m., when thermal signals indicated Brackett had returned inside the cabin and extinguished lights, the containment team began deployment. 3 tactical squads approached from north, west, and east to block escape into the valley. A Shasta specialized ranger unit guided the approach to minimize noise and avoid leaving tracks. Once the cabin was in range, the team leader signaled activation of tactical lights and simultaneous breaching of the front door with a pneumatic ram. Brackett was subdued in under 6 seconds after the door burst open. He was unarmed at the moment and appeared completely surprised, though a wooden-handled bushknife was within arm's reach inside the cabin, indicating he maintained defensive habits. Immediately after cuffing the suspect, the search team swept the cabin interior, recovering more than a dozen items matching samples from the cell and body scenes, 3 pre-cut rolls of 8-braid paracord, a serrated knife with melted nylon fibers on the edge, a Shasta topographic map with the southeastern area circled in red ink, accompanied by handwritten notes, including generator maintenance schedules and cycle count times marked with repeated symbols. In an old wooden crate, investigators found chemical bottles used for equipment cleaning, including ethylene oxide sterilization tablets, the exact type detected on Evan's hair. Additionally, under the cabin bed was a metal box containing various small items, rope scraps, rubber gloves, old blades, duct tape, and short handwritten notes with controlling or reproachful phrasing similar to the sentence structure on the paper, recovered near Daniel's body. Once the cabin was fully secured, mobile forensic equipment was brought in to ensure no fingerprints, DNA, or soil samples linking the cabin to the cell were missed. Several soil samples from Brackett's boot soles matched the composition of soil taken near the cell, strengthening the geographic evidence chain. All evidence was cataloged, placed in sealed boxes, and transferred to the lab for deeper analysis. Brackett's arrest concluded without casualties and preserved the entire secondary crime scene, the cabin, surrounding area, and his usual travel routes for future prosecution. Within 3 hours of capture, Brackett was transferred to a federal holding facility, formally ending the freedom of the individual believed to have operated the underground detention system for nearly a decade. Brackett was placed in a high-security interrogation room, where investigators employed the protocol for structured long-term violent offenders, minimizing direct confrontation, controlling pacing, and alternating closed and open questions to expose small inconsistencies in statements. After nearly 2 hours of silence and evasion, Brackett began providing initial details when investigators placed before him copies of cell photos, restraint marks, and the positions of the 2 bodies. Recognizing the evidence was overwhelming, he shifted to describing the October 13, 2012 ambush of the trio. According to him, he had scouted the climbing route from morning, noted their uneven but predictable pace, and waited at the auxiliary side trail near the previously identified GPS offset point. He claimed to have observed for about 25 minutes before deliberately creating a light noise to distract the group, then using a narrow path and a low brush to separate them from the main trail. When asked how he split the victims, Brackett described engineering a situation that forced all 3 to stop throwing a large rock downslope to draw Regina's attention and cause her to approach, while Joel and Evan stood a few meters apart. He approached from behind, quickly wrapping a rope segment around Daniel's wrist to immobilize him first, then subdued Joel as he turned to assist. Evan was forced downslope by pulling force, causing him to slide off the trail. These descriptions matched the drag marks and disturbed snow areas recorded by 2012 drone footage after AI restoration. When questioned about transporting the 3 to the cell, Brackett stated it took him nearly 3 hours to drag each person through narrow forest paths, using a homemade sled fashioned from old planks and paracord, of the same forensic match type to reduce the load. He bound them with 8-braid rope and secured wrists in a reversed behind-the-back configuration, consistent with injury patterns on Daniel's and Joel's bones as well as ligature marks on Evan's wrists. Upon reaching the cell, he temporarily barricaded the entrance, then placed each inside, separating them in cycles, one held in the pit, two temporarily confined in a rock alcove 20 meters away. This rotation schedule lasted the first 3 weeks to determine who responded best, a clear indicator of psychological control behavior. This statement aligned with faint DNA found at 2 previously unexplained depressed soil spots near the cell, now identified as secondary holding points. Regarding Joel's death in 2013, Brackett claimed Joel did not adapt, repeatedly attempting to stand or break free, causing him to progressively tighten the restraints. One day, Joel lost consciousness after prolonged restricted breathing. Instead of seeking help or attempting rescue, he dragged the body to the eastern clearing and buried it that same night. This matched the forensic conclusion. Joel died from extended hypoxia with no signs of violent trauma. When asked about Daniel, Brackett's demeanor shifted. He described Daniel as more compliant, better at conserving energy, and able to endure long cycles, implying he kept Daniel alive longer due to his submissiveness. The statement indicated minimal rations on a 3-day cycle, consistent with nutritional analysis from Evan's hair. Daniel's 2016 death, per Brackett, occurred after an illness from cold and water, when Daniel lost the ability to stand and became unresponsive. He left Daniel unattended for 2 days before burying him near the sulfur vent area to use the odor to conceal decomposition. The burial site precisely matched the discovered location. When questioning turned to Evan, Brackett described him as the easiest to maintain, a chilling but confirming statement of his control model. He stated Evan survived due to minimal resistance, low energy expenditure, and compliance with signals. This aligned with forensic findings. Evan showed fewer violent injuries, but severe malnutrition and advanced osteoporosis from prolonged confinement. Regarding the final phase, Brackett noted the generator failed for several weeks at the end, making the pit darker than usual, and he had to travel far from the cabin to retrieve spare parts left at an old mining site. While absent, Evan found the escape when wind dislodged a rotted wooden panel at the pit entrance. Brackett admitted he had been careless and didn't think the kid could get far. Ultimately, when the full statement was cross-referenced with forensic data, Joel's 2013 time of death, Daniel's 2016, captivity cycles, ligature marks, diet, chemical odors, generator noise, everything aligned, confirming a prolonged criminal pattern from 2012 to 2020, involving 3 victims held by the same method, but with differing outcomes. Brackett's confession not only completed the crime timeline, but reconstructed the entire 8-year captivity process, a closed, deliberately regulated system sustained by the cold calculation of an isolated behaviorally deviant individual. The trial of Leonard Brackett took place in the spring of 2021 at the federal courthouse in the Eastern District of California, where jurisdiction was extended due to the case involving years-long kidnapping and movement across federal forest lands. The prosecution presented the case in a tightly structured manner, beginning with 2012 physical evidence, rare tactical boot prints, 8-braid paracord, deviated GPS trackline, and AI-recovered drone flyover images, leading to the chain of 2020 crime scene forensic evidence from the discovered underground cell, including homemade manacles, a wooden mouth cover panel for the pit, partially burned cord fragments, a day-count tally board, and faint fingerprint smudges on the wall, matching prints taken from the suspect's cabin. The forensic presentation continued with Evan's medical forensic report, cyclical bone density loss, circumferential wrist scarring from restraints, microfractures on the forearms, signs of chronic malnutrition, layered ethylene oxide accumulation in hair strands, and suppressed neural reflexes, all indicating he had been confined in an enclosed environment for 8 full years. Prosecutors emphasized that these injuries perfectly matched the structure of the underground cell, and aligned with Brackett's own statements about how he restricted victims' movement and rations. They then displayed a sensory mapping diagram to demonstrate the reverse tracing from Evans' descriptions to the cell's discovery, creating a tight linkage between sensory memory and geographic evidence. Next, the centerpiece of the trial was Evans' testimony. Despite ongoing mental health impacts, Evan was permitted to testify after experts confirmed his cognitive capacity and the reliability of his fragmented memories. He described the uneven hum of the generator, the smell of disinfectant chemicals, dripping water, and the confined space that forced him to duck his head when standing. When shown a photo of the dripping water pipe inside the cell, Evans stated, "That's the sound I heard every night," a detail powerful enough to convince the jury of the authenticity and consistency of his experience. When describing Joel and Daniel, Evan could not provide an exact timeline, but recalled that they stopped answering after a while, which aligned with forensic analysis determining Joel's death in 2013 and Daniel's in 2016. Brackett's own statements, though defense counsel attempted to portray them as perceptually unstable, were used by prosecutors as evidence by demonstrating near-perfect alignment with forensics. The burial locations of Joel and Daniel, the type of binding cord, the cell's construction, Evan's cyclical health decline, and the location of the side trail where the 2012 ambush occurred. Even more significantly, a scrap of paper bearing the warning, "He wouldn't listen, I can't let that happen again," was subjected to handwriting analysis, with experts concluding a 95% match to Brackett's handwriting from prior legal records. This served as evidence of a dark psychological control motive and cyclical escalation of behavior, an aggravating factor that heightened the severity of the charges. Defense counsel argued that Brackett lacked full mental capacity at the time of the offenses, citing his isolated lifestyle and history of behavioral disorders. Prosecutors countered by pointing to the level of preparation in the cell, underground structure, false escape route, fixed restraint system, generator, controlled water supply, victim separation methods, and rotating restraint schedule, which demonstrated sustained, calculated conduct that could not be attributed to a state of diminished capacity. After 8 days of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Leonard Brackett was guilty of murder in the first degree for Joel Carter and Daniel Rios, kidnapping with aggravated circumstances for Evan Lake, and continuous torture from 2012-2020. The judge sentenced based on the brutality, duration, and systematic nature of the conduct, 2 consecutive life sentences without parole for the 2 murder-1 counts, plus 40 additional consecutive years for the kidnapping and torture charges. When the sentence was read, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Evan sat in the back, showing no dramatic emotion but clenching his fist tightly, as though one part of his 8 years of captivity had finally been officially named. With this verdict, the court affirmed that the evidence from the scene, forensics and testimony, including Brackett's own admissions, was sufficient to close one of the longest-running and most complex missing persons cases in Shasta region history. Once Leonard Brackett's sentence was pronounced and the case legally closed, the investigating agencies began a comprehensive after-action review of the entire process from 2012 to 2021 to assess strengths, weaknesses, and operational errors that had allowed the initial disappearance to remain stalled for nearly a decade. The summary report identified the single greatest failure of the 2012 search as the SAR team's failure to expand coverage into the southeastern rock forest area, where the underground cell and actual burial sites were located. The grid search protocol at the time relied too heavily on the main trail, assuming the 3 hikers would not deviate from their registered route, while the anomalous GPS trackline deviation was not treated as a signal of forced deviation. Additionally, evidence analysis techniques of the era were limited, causing the paracord segment and tactical boot prints to be dismissed as unidentified extraneous factors rather than indicators of deliberate human activity. The October 13th night drone flyover showing no clear anomalies further reinforced the mistaken assumption of no unusual activity near the trail. Investigative experts concluded that if 2012 had access to the AI image analysis technology available in 2020, drag marks and snow disturbances would likely have been detected, opening new investigative avenues much earlier. Alongside the operational review, forensic medicine continued analyzing anomalies in Evans' medical reports, an extraordinary survival case after 8 years in extremely harsh confinement conditions. Prolonged dangerous vitamin D deficiency, severe but partially recoverable bone density loss, and the ability to maintain survival in a confined space with minimal nutrition raised many questions about physiological adaptation under long-term captivity. Evans' hair samples showed layered ethylene oxide accumulation consistent with a sealed chemical disinfectant environment, yet this remained debated because no prior studies had documented such stable buildup in a living human over many years. Furthermore, Evans' severe photosensitivity, near mild burns upon initial sun exposure in the first week after rescue, exceeded typical responses in individuals kept in darkness, leading several physicians to question whether the confinement environment included chemical or thermal factors that thinned skin protection. Another striking detail was the unusually rapid bone healing observed in old microfractures. Despite severe demineralization, many microcracks showed signs of unusually fast union, contrary to expectations in prolonged malnutrition. No clear explanation exists for this combination of extreme wasting and localized recovery, leading some experts to hypothesize that prolonged immobility may trigger rare adaptive mechanisms. Although these anomalies did not affect the legal outcome, they became the subject of separate post-case medical research reports aimed at better understanding the impact of long-term confinement on biological and neurological systems. The case closure summary concluded that this was an extraordinary case, not only because of the extreme brutality and duration of the crimes, but also because of the complexity of the evidence trail, a scattered chain of tiny clues over 8 years that could only be assembled thanks to advances in forensic technology and the sole surviving victim's testimony. While Leonard Brackett's criminal file is closed, Evans' medical file remains open as a long-term research case. Physicians continue monitoring bone density recovery, light sensitivity, endocrine changes, and signs of neural damage to better understand the mechanisms by which 8 years of enclosed captivity affected the human body. The case is closed, but the scientific questions it raises persist, becoming an inseparable part of one of the strangest long-term confinement cases ever documented in modern investigative history. The story of the 3 missing hikers at Mount Shasta and Evans' 8-year journey held in darkness is not merely a complex criminal case. It reflects very real risks in modern American life, where people often assume that outdoor adventures, hiking trails, or camping trips are safe, thanks to advanced technology and sophisticated rescue systems. The case shows that even popular recreational areas still contain legal blind spots and zones beyond routine law enforcement observation, where dangerous individuals can operate undetected for years. The detail that the group had registered their route, carried adequate gear, and notified return times, yet the search system still failed in 2012, serves as a reminder that personal safety never depends solely on procedure. In real life, this translates into critical habits. Always share detailed itineraries with multiple people, carry active locating devices, and update positions periodically when entering forests or wilderness areas. The case also highlights past weaknesses in investigative systems. Small pieces of evidence, like a length of paracord or unusual boot prints, were once downplayed. On a personal level, this is a reminder not to ignore anomalies in everyday life. A neighbor with erratic behavior, signs of unauthorized habitation in a forest area, seemingly minor things that can sometimes form pieces of much larger crimes. But the deepest lesson comes from Evan. 8 years locked in darkness, loss of light exposure, malnutrition, and bone damage did not erase his will to survive. This touches a core American cultural value: resilience, mental endurance. In a society facing natural disasters, violence, rising mental health crises, and increasing isolation, Evan's story reminds us that the capacity to rise after adversity is not just raw survival instinct. It is also a journey that requires support from community, medicine, technology, and justice. It calls for building a society that is vigilant yet compassionate, strong yet not indifferent, where no one is swallowed by darkness without anyone noticing. If you're interested in strange cases and real-life survival lessons like the Mount Shasta story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any future investigative journeys. Thank you for staying with the story to the end, and see you in the next video where we continue exploring mysteries still hidden from the light.